So we're face to face, Eamon, which is always a bit unsettling. No offense. I hope you don't take in our new studio here.
No, I know the feeling now.
Do you not?
I share the feeling. I share the discomfort.
You don't crave that intimacy with me either, I'd imagine, do you?
Well, let's not talk about that in public.
Yes, exactly. So let's move on. And we'll move on to one of the guys who has been a key figure in Limerick's criminal underworld, but is maybe a bit less known than some of them. But we had Fat John McCarthy in the Sunday World this week, reappearing at a funeral. A guy called David Nolan, a kind of a former criminal himself, who passed away. And Fat John, you could see him even being greeted with that kind of respect from other mourners at the funeral, because he has been a very, very significant player for a long time.
Yeah, so I mean, Fat John McCarthy's from Moyross. I suppose his younger brother, Eds McCarthy, would be better known. But I suppose for lack of a better piece of terminology, in a way, he'd be kind of Limerick City royalty, in that his uncles, Eddie Ryan and John Ryan, who were both murdered during the feud, and then his cousins, Eddie and Kieran Ryan, the son of Eddie Ryan, they've also kind of gone into business with him over the years. And you know, and they're very much a separate organised criminal gang. I know that they were often kind of lumped in as being part of the McCarthy Dundon gang, but there's no direct relationship in terms of they're not necessarily directly related as such to the Dundons.
No, I think there is some familial link, but it's a
there's nothing direct, you know.
Because obviously the Dundon's mother was Anne Doll McCarthy, and she was a McCarthy, but it was more Noddy McCarthy and the people like that from Weston who were the first cousins of the Dundons. The Moyross McCarthys are much more distantly related.
Yeah, and I think they did actually operate. They aligned, but were very much a separate organised crime group, and of course would have had their own kind of like nasty feuds going on with the Collopys and the Keens as well. Of course, you know, obviously. You know, Fat John, I think we had pictures or something at the time. You know, he was photographed celebrating Kieran Keen's murder in 2003. And, you know, he himself would have been shot at a couple of times. There was one occasion, I think 11 rounds from an AK-47 were fired at the house in Moyross. And one of his kids, who was 9 at the time, was lucky to escape injury.
Yeah, because you go back to the origins of the feud, and really, in the first ever bits of reporting about it, they would have referred to the Ryan McCarthy gang, really, in Moyross, in being involved in a feud with the Keane family, because both John and Eddie Ryan, they were both ultimately murdered, and they were both sort of, I suppose, really well known sort of local hard men and criminals at that point.
Yeah, look, very much so. I mean, Eddie Ryan's murder is kind of seen as the first fatality, and really kicked off the level of violence in it. You know, and I suppose the Fat John would have. I think he was always very much one of these characters that kind of he saw the downside of this kind of public violence, and he saw the downside of letting things get in the way of business. And, you know, we do know that, like, he was very much like to be in control of things. You know, his modus operandi would be very much to handle things himself, and to use young guys as, you know, as the kind of the helpers. And of course, it was partly it was kind of his downfall, in a sense. Like, he did a long stretch in prison. I think it was in 2012 he was jailed, and he actually ended up getting a 14-year sentence, which was quite serious when you consider it was 145,000 euro worth of heroin, which was basically an outdoor bagging area. And the guards came across them. I think they obviously had good information, and they observed what was going on and chased after him. And he was arrested, and they were able to. I mean, it was down to the evidence of the guards to say who they saw at the scene. And to get a sentence like that was quite significant. He wasn't out till 2021, so he was inside for, you know, a decent stretch, just over 9 years in prison.
I think it might have got slightly reduced on appeal, but not by significant amount, maybe by a couple of years. And the sentence, I think, reflected some of the evidence given by Gardaí. It also reflects the fact that he didn't plead guilty. But it did reflect some of the evidence and the significance they placed on Fat John, because you see, as the Dundons landed on the scene in Limerick, and as that feud progressed, that area of Moyross really was controlled by Fat John really for a period of time. Moyross is a bigger area probably than what the Dundons were managing, and Fat John McCarthy also, like the Dundons, he had an association with really, I suppose, what would be the Kinnigan cartel, people from that sort of Crumlin, Drimnagh area. They were spotted on occasions going down there. I think Graham Whelan was spotted at some point meeting up with Fat John.
Yeah.
Now he wasn't. There was no charges resulted out of that, but they were.
I think it was. There was a time when the information would have been that he was buying the heroin or getting the drugs supplied from Dublin via Fat Freddie Thompson. Now, then, in retrospect, it turns out they had a completely separate supply route.
Yes.
And you know, so, but it does kind of show you again, like, you know, the level of links, and we know, like, from his younger brother Ed's McCarthy's kind of criminal career, moving to Birmingham and essentially, you know, being close to Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, like the cartel Kinahan's number one man in the UK before his downfall. It kind of gives you a sense of how far up the scale the McCarthys were. So when you see this guy at the funeral wearing his shell jacket, you know, his puffet jacket, you wouldn't look twice at him if you didn't know who he was. And you know, we actually photographed him at another funeral, I think in 2022. A young woman called Amanda Donoghue, and he was again dressed in a similar fashion and kind of low key. And he met up there with his cousins, the two Ryans, again, and they were photographed together. And you know, but even the fact that he was at an O'Donoghue funeral, which is now kind of, that young woman's graveyard or her grave memorial was smashed up recently, you know, as part of an ongoing feud between gangs in Ballinacurra Weston and that part of town. But again, it shows you again the links that Fat John has had throughout the years, despite being inside in prison and despite, I suppose, being in the shadow of the more famous McCarthys like Red Larry McCarthy and, of course, the Dundons as well, the Dundon brothers. And we know that they had a falling out with the Dundons at one point.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happened in the 2000s were that the Dundons really took a sort of stranglehold on both Weston and in Moyross, and they were really dictating the terms of that feud, because remember, a lot of shootings were going on. There was a full-on war on the streets with the Keen Collopies, and the Dundons really rose to the top. But I think at some point John Dundon had gone into prison, served a relatively short sentence, had come out, and he had tried to reassert control over the Moyross McCarthys. And at that point, the McCarthys had really had enough of them, enough of the Dundons trying to push them around, and they tried to take out a hit on them, basically. And they were, while the Dundons were undoubtedly the most notorious criminals in the country at that time, probably, the McCarthys in reality were a lot stronger, a lot of a bigger faction, a lot more organised, and had no fear of John Dundon, no matter what his reputation would be. I think the Moyross, of course, it's a huge estate, isn't it? Like, I mean, it's a huge area, and you know, it's one of those complicated areas to police, I think, if you've ever been in there.
Yeah, no, I've been there, all right, and it's like, when you say it's a huge area, in one sense it is. But again, in you know, in terms of, I suppose, the footprint within Limerick City, it's a small kind of area. It's probably less than, you know, a square kilometre.
Yeah.
But as you say, it's very complex, and it'd be a very difficult place to police as well, because, of course, you've got various people who are related to all the various factions living in the same area, and just because you have a distant relation with somebody on one side doesn't necessarily mean you align with that particular faction. And we saw that over the years, you know, in terms of just I suppose sometimes the level of violence that could flare up. And there was always that undercurrent of intimidation that, you know, people's houses would get burnt or attacked, and, you know, people being forced to move out. And of course, that it wasn't just confined to Moyross. There was some other parts of the city where that was almost like it was a modus operandi for a lot of the gangs to kind of ethnically cleanse a street, so to speak, or a corner of a street or an area, so that they could, you know, stay in control and make sure that the people nearby were loyalists, and they weren't people that could necessarily give statements at some point to the guards and wouldn't be witnessing the everyday drug dealing that was going on. Because that's the one thing I find unusual about say, like, Fat John McCarthy and even the Dundons, they're very much hands-on drug dealers. I mean, in a sense, when you look at, I suppose that they're parallel in the Colopes. There was two of those were caught red-handed, bagging up cocaine in a house, the same way as Fat John was caught red-handed with two young guys, in an area. What was it called? The Four Walls. It's a kind of an outdoor area not too far from Moyross. And runs away through the forest, is chased by the guards, and tries to claim that the cuts and scratches he got were because he came home from holiday and found that somebody had a party in his house and he wasn't happy, and that's how we got the scrapes and so on. So I mean, it's real kind of street level at one side, and yet we know then that he's meeting with people, or his brother as well, meeting with people who are at the high end of the Kinnan cartel. So it's kind of anomalous, I guess, in a sense. Like it's not the Hollywood gangster style, like, that the fact that these guys are still on the street. And
no, I mean, they're not buying apartments in the Al Jumeirah in Dubai for sure.
But there's no doubt, and we do know some of them have apartments in places like Turkey and Spain and Bulgaria and so on. So I mean, there is that element to it.
And of course, Fat John and his associates very much invested in horses. That was a big thing, I think, that he was into, and some of his key allies were very much into the sulky racing. That was also a way to make criminal connections, I suppose. But
it was kind of the golf course, isn't it, of the underworld a bit?
It is.
And he got prosecuted twice for that. I think there was in the early noughties, he was done for that. He was brought up to district court for keeping horses in his house or at the back garden. And again, I think after he got out of prison then in 2021, I think it was part of the spin-off from Operation Coronation, which was the targeting of all the finances at that level, which I think from what we've seen in the court cases certainly seemed to have hit the Keens and the Keene Colopy a lot harder than Fat John and Eds McCarthy. Of course, Eds having previously been done by the Criminal Assets Bureau, where he had cash, a car and a Rolex watch taken from him, as well as his name spread across the newspapers as well.
Absolutely. But I mean, the horses were a big thing, and a big sort of a big enthusiasm from both sides, actually, in that Limerick feud. Now, the McCarthys and the Keens, while the Dundons kind of fell out of the picture, and to a degree the Colopys did as well, because many of the Colopy faction ended up in prison. But really the core of that feud is between the Keene faction and the McCarthy faction, and that's where a lot of the bad blood remains to this day.
Yeah, I mean, there was like, I mean, it was the Colopy's father. I think it was the original. Got involved with, wasn't it? There was a fatal car accident, or one of the Colopys, and that there was constant demands for money from a particular guy, and it ended up then in serious violence, and there was a kind of an attempt at a mass shooting at a caravan in Limerick, and that was even that was a couple of years before the likes of Eddie Ryan was killed, and then of course his brother John Ryan a short time after that. So I mean, like, it's funny enough, like after I think it was it Eddie Ryan's murder, Fat John actually did make a few comments to the press in Limerick at the time, and he was saying that basically the Gangland feud was never going to end. He said, all I can say is it's not going to stop. It's gone on too long now. And he referred to his own house having been targeted, and that how they nearly killed his child. And talking about, it was John Ryan. He says, Johnny knew he was a target, but he didn't expect this to happen. I told him loads of times to stay out of the Thomond Gate area and that it was too dangerous.
And I think he famously said, was asked, was he afraid of going to prison? And he said, it's a holiday camp.
Yeah.
That was one of the...
Yeah, that was prime time, I think, in 2010, 2011. Yeah. And he was
because a lot of that was around... Some of those interviews are around the time of the famous fake kidnapping. Of his, I think they're his cousins, aren't they? Rashers and
first cousins,
Rashers, and is it Rashers and Eds, Ryan?
Ed's, Eddie and Kieran,
So they were it was one of those incidents where it was reported that they had been kidnapped, basically, but ultimately it appears to have been a ruse. That they weren't kidnapped, they just disappeared. And obviously they'd been reported that being kidnapped, there'd been huge alerts had gone out, obviously, because they had their own links to criminality, and it was suspected that they were ultimately had been abducted to be killed. But then they reappeared. And in that, it generated a huge amount of publicity, obviously, because it was at the height of the violence in or around the murder of Kieran Keane Sr. and a very sort of tense moment in Gangland. And I think Fat John at that point, RTE and everybody else descended, and he gave some of these quotes at the time to local media.
Yeah, well, look, I mean that was, I mean that famous double cross, all right, that in which Kieran Keane was killed and Owen Tracy was left for dead but survived, and attempts then to lure other members of the Keane gang, to a bogus meeting to have them killed as well. And I suppose for a lot of people that was the first awareness that there was something going on in Limerick, even though at that stage it was kind of, we were 8 or 9 years already into the kind of the serious violence at that stage, maybe kind of 2 years or 3 years into the murders. But that was the real wake up call, I think.
Yeah.
Like nationwide in terms of that. And, and the McCarthys were in the thick of things at that stage. They really were. Like, and, apart from John McCarthy's house being attacked, he was also linked to other events that, we've written about in the past that were connected to the feud as well. Like, he wasn't despite, the way he kind of comes across in some of the brief comments he's made, he wasn't a passive person sitting in the area not getting involved,
And of course, ultimately his cousin David Frog Eye Stanners was convicted of the murder of Kieran Keane Sr. He would ultimately be found dead in jail just before he was due to be released. So, but what you have seen, I think, in Moyross and in Limerick generally, in terms of the underworld, you have this new generation that are very closely aligned with these kind of senior figures, and they're all starting to emerge. But these kind of patriarchal gang leaders like Christy Keane, like Fat John, they remain at the scene and they remain people of great significance.
Yeah, and you're talking about, like, I mean, for instance, Fat John's son David was done for gun possession in 2010. So, I mean, you're talking about, he's in his early 30s now. So you have a number of people, like, from various sides, who's the second generation, or are connected to it in a very serious way. Some of them are currently serving sentences for drug dealing in the likes of the Island Field and so on. Certainly Owen Tracy is one of those.
Owen Tracy Jr.
Owen Tracy Jr.
Yeah.
So I mean, there is that kind of fear, I think, and we see that with the current feud going on in the Hyde Road area at the minute, that the second generation, while the previous generation have kind of calmed down and got back to business, that the old tribal alliances are surging up again, and that that there's a young crowd are barely being held in check at the minute. They want to carve out their own reputation and carve out their own territories, and maybe aren't quite happy to accept the status quo, which has kept the peace.
Yeah, and in fact, you could argue we're possibly onto a third generation as well. Amazingly, if you think about it. But so no doubt we'll be coming back to them all, Eamon, at some stage as we keep.
I think they'll be still going when we retire as journalists, Niall. I think, to be perfectly frank about it.
Yes, possibly so. Thanks, Eamon.
That was a pleasure, Niall.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.